Thank you so much, Pastor Craig. Yeah, let's give him a round of applause, everyone. But thank you again all for joining us this evening. As Pastor Craig mentioned, my name is Rachel Joseph, and I am the New York City Administrative Director at Cornell University, overseeing their administrative operations. But prior to that, I've had 10 years experience working within city government, providing leadership and guidance to both law enforcement officials as well as community organizations in reducing recidivism within Manhattan. But enough about me. We want to know about the panelists, right? And why we're here this evening. So to my left, your right, we have Wasing Chu, who is an avid chef and father to 3 girls. Wasing moved to New York for work in 2010, and as a member of the leadership team, Wasing has attended Hope, Jersey City since its founding time with his wife, Kristen, and works in the finance industry. Next, we have Dorothy Chang. Dorothy Chang is the president of Code with Clossy, a nonprofit offering free education and leadership opportunities in technology to young women and non-binary teens. She has worked in the tech industry for the past 17 years as a marketer and investor, mostly focused on growing and transforming startup brands like Foursquare and WordPress. She is of Taiwanese descent and was born and raised in New York. She and her Korean-American husband, Andrew, are now raising their 2 sons in New Jersey. And Dorothy has also been attending Hope since our founding times. Next, we have Eunice Yoon. So Eunice works at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission's Division of Examination and examines investment advertisers as well as companies. She graduated from Rutgers Law School, and prior to law school, she was a paralegal at Philadelphia Legal Assistants. She has a BA in sociology from Haverford College and has been attending Hope, Jersey City since March of 2017. And last but not least, we have Michael Jung. Michael Jung spent the majority of his career working in nonprofits on racial justice and issues that impact marginalized populations. Currently, he works in immigrant and refugee rights funding. He was born in South Korea and grew up in California. He originally moved to New York City for graduate school, where he met his, and I quote, beautiful wife. He and his wife, Eunice, have been attending Hope since 2019. Thank you all so much for being with us this evening. To start us off, I want to turn to Michael Jung to provide us with a historical perspective and current reality of the hatred and violence that has been ensued within our country towards the Asian American population. Michael, would you start us off, please?
Thank you. I'd like to give a brief overview on racism that API communities have faced in U.S. history, some of the policy impacts, and predominant racial frames that are impacting or attributed to Asians, as well as some recent trends that we've been seeing with the rise of violence against Asians in this country. So I hope that people will get a better sense of the challenges exacerbated in this current environment in order for us to be able to better support our fellow brothers and sisters as a church family. So racism and violence against Asians. Oh, it's not on? Sorry about that. What did it film?
Okay. Oh.
Is it working? Sorry about that. I'll just leave it right here and not touch it. I will just jump in. So racism and violence against Asians have been exacerbated over the last year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, anti-Asian bigotry has been an inherent part of the Asian American experience throughout history. So one of the early dominant frames of fear and racism attributed to Asians in America was the Yellow Peril. The Yellow Peril first became an issue in California in the 1870s when white working class laborers, fearful of losing their jobs amidst an economic decline, discriminated against what was termed filthy yellow hordes from Asia. This tension between communities eventually led to the federal passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which prohibited immigration from China and forbade legal residents from becoming citizens. By preventing workers from entering and barring existing residents from naturalization, the act deepened divides between citizens and aliens. Officials at that time faced the difficult task of regulating harbors and the borders between US and Canada. Consequently, they turned to white townspeople to report on their neighbors, which is a horrible idea. This form of border patrol proved unreliable as townspeople tended to target Asians indiscriminately, which exacerbated racial tensions in previously integrated neighborhoods. When violence broke out and officials failed to condemn it, they effectively recognized vigilantes as extensions of federal and state border regulation. In the Pacific Northwest at the time, where locals couldn't yet vote in national elections, some community leaders justified racial violence as a form of political action, and the federal government did little to discourage them. So during the Rock Springs Massacre of 1885 in Wyoming, white miners killed 28 Chinese workers and forced out hundreds before they set their homes on fire. Emboldened by this incident, vigilantes in Tacoma, Washington, banded together with officials to announce the peaceful removal of Chinese residents. Though Tacomans looted and burned down houses, editorial staff at the LA Times and a lot of the papers in the West at the time wrote this up as a successful blueprint for Chinese expulsion. So the Tacoma method would inspire vigilante expulsions of Chinese communities all across the US. In the following 3 years, there were over 200 cities and towns that would see similar incidents. So the legislation formulated at this time was a way for the systematic surveillance of Asians in the US. So in 1892, there was a Gary Act, which required all Chinese migrants to undergo a registration system and provide affirmative proof of their right to reside on US soil. This was unheard of at the time. This new system effectively transformed the Chinese Exclusion Act to an Expulsion Act, and by targeting the long-term residents and border patrol, was no longer confined to the borders, but actually extended now to the interior. So exclusionary policies during this time drove migration underground. Chinese communities that were once integrated with neighborhoods and workplaces ended up going to segregated enclaves, while some of the others were completely isolated and scattered across the country. This had long-lasting effects to this day. The effects are less than 10% Chinese of Americans today can trace their lineage back 3 generations in the US. In Tacoma, where the burning down of the settlement happened, a decade-long search for descendants found that they couldn't find any Chinese from that time or their descendants. So I would say the height of the yellow peril, or this concept, occurred after Pearl Harbor, as many people know about the Japanese internment. During that time, there was a lot of popular imagery, particularly in political cartoons, some done even by the beloved Dr. Seuss at the time, that debased Japanese as subhuman apes, treacherous in nature, morally corrupt, and mentally and physical lesser to Americans. This viewpoint of the Japanese as subhuman fueled the movement towards putting Japanese Americans into internment camps in 1942. So while Japanese Americans faced the full wrath of the yellow peril, at that time, Chinese were allies in the Asian theater, and somehow, even though they were discriminated against, they were now considered the good Asians. Right after Pearl Harbor, Times Magazine printed a guide on distinguishing between Chinese and Japanese, which included a lot of offensive things about Oriental eyes and personality traits. But soon after, the Cold War would happen again, which makes Chinese enemies to America again, and it's just a rotating cast of Asian caricatures. An important characteristic that I wanted to highlight about the yellow peril is that there is a theme that implies that Asians are unclean and unfit to be citizens in America. So thinking about the historical lens of public health crises, in 1900, there was a bubonic plague outbreak in Honolulu, which led health officials to burn down Chinatown. Local Asians pointed out that the quarantine zone was discriminatory. There was an Asian-owned mill, and right next door was a white business, but somehow the white business was not part of the quarantine, and somehow the quarantine-free peninsula of white businesses extended into Chinatown. The fire wiped out 25 city blocks and displaced 6,000 Chinese residents. Similarly, when the plague hit San Francisco, authorities restricted the movement of 25,000 Chinese residents, including 1,000 Japanese Americans. Whites were allowed to leave within the quarantine zone because it was believed, like in Hawaii, they were less likely to get the disease. Not one Caucasian business on the rim of the quarantine district was affected, while Asians were imprisoned within the lines. The editors of a popular newspaper at the time demanded that Chinatown be burned down as well. They wrote, "So long as it stands, so long will there be a menace in San Francisco of every form of disease, plague, and pestilence which Asiatic filth and vice generate. The only way to get rid of that menace is to eradicate Chinatown, clear the foul spot, and give the debris to the flames." To switch gears to a more recent example, the 2003 SARS outbreak. In North America, the disease was mainly confined to Canada, but there were reports of harassments towards Asians in both countries. Media outlets at the time were covering the SARS outbreak with images of Asian businesses and Asians wearing masks, even though they have nothing to do with the stories. And we even saw elevated racism against Asian healthcare workers. So while publicly we're celebrating healthcare workers for their work in hospitals, these people found themselves fearing for their safety on their way homes. Reports at the time said that fear was spreading faster than the virus, which led to Chinatowns in some US cities to see an 80% drop in revenue from previous years. These fears came even though in the end there was not a single SARS-related death in the US. So I hope people can see, given this context and repeated instances in our country's history when a public health crisis is used as justification to marginalize Asians, that terms like China virus, which may not be as innocuous as some think, can actually have really harmful impacts. This includes all racial rhetoric like Chinese plague and Kung flu that associates Asians with COVID-19. As nonsensical as it may seem to believe Asian Americans cause COVID, which some people believe, we have seen countless examples where perpetrators of violence use this baseless claim as justifications for their brutality. I want to quickly touch on two other frames because I think they're really important to the modern understanding of how Asian Americans are perceived in society. Over the 20th century, we see more modern frames like the perpetual foreigner and model minority. The perpetual foreigner stereotype has meant that Asian Americans have been denied the ability to be unquestionably American. When you're seen as foreign, in the context of how our society operates, sometimes you're seen as disposable or exploitable. This is not a casual discrimination. This is a deep-seated bias that sustains a lot of the structural exploitations in our economy, and if you even look at our labor history. So by 1924, with the exception of Filipino nationals, all Asian immigrants were, by law, denied citizenship, naturalization, prevented from marrying whites, and owning land. Switching gears to the term of model minority, this was first coined by a sociologist in 1966 named William Peterson. In an article he wrote about Japanese Americans in the New York Times Magazine. Peterson claimed that it was through diligence and hard work rooted in values that Japanese were able to avoid becoming what was considered a problem minority. So the model minority myth suggests that there is a distinct quality in Asian Americans tied to their success which other groups of color must not possess. It makes flawed comparisons between Asian Americans and other groups, including Black Americans, to argue that racism with more than 2 centuries of Black enslavement and ongoing intergenerational structures of discrimination is easily overcome with hard work and family values. This view pits Asian Americans against other communities of color, which perpetuates systems of oppression, racial hierarchy, and white privilege. Not only does this myth ignore history and the role of Asian American policy, it doesn't account for the variances within the Asian community. So for example, the API community is comprised of over 25 ethnic groups. While Asians are generally considered financially better off or having higher median incomes, they also have the highest wealth disparity out of all the racial groups. So the lowest rung on the poverty ladder happens to be Asian, which is a fact that's not usually discussed. So to conclude, to think about how this all fits into the modern context, we see that the model minority frame impacts the perceptions of people today. So recently, there's a group called Launch, Leading Asian Americans to Unite for Change. They released a survey and it showed that 80% of Asian respondents feel like they've been discriminated against in the US. 45% of Asian adults have experienced an incident in the last year during the pandemic related to their racial background. As a juxtaposition, 37% of white Americans say they aren't aware of an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans, and 24% believe that anti-Asian racism is not a problem that should be addressed. I will say hate crimes against Asians are a problem, and incidents of violence continue to be particularly high here locally in the New York City metro area. So the New York City Commission on Human Rights, they've been fielding reports on anti-Asian attacks. In 2020, the agency received more than 200 reports of anti-Asian discrimination and violence. That's a 7-fold increase from 2019. Overall, 16 of the largest US cities have seen a 164% increase in violence towards Asians in the first quarter of 2021. And the Stop AAPI Hate Coalition released a report last month where they've said that there's already been almost 7,000 attacks and incidents of discrimination against Asians since the start of the pandemic. So despite growing calls and attention to this issue, 3,000 of those reports happened in the first quarter of this year. So things are moving along. In May of this year, Congress passed legislation to address hate crimes through the pandemic, which emphasizes violence against Asian American. This bill tries to make reporting more accessible to different population, increases funding for local crime reduction programs. It mandates the DOJ to expedite and identify hate crimes better. I will say currently there doesn't seem to be consensus in the API rights community whether this bill is going to make a meaningful difference at all. I will state, however, that data at face value is hard to take. Hate crimes are often underreported, and many attacks we've seen recently aren't being classified as hate crimes. This all affects the stats, and the stats may not capture the true scope of this problem that this bill seeks to improve. Just to end, I want to say that as a society, we should recognize the importance of representation, public education, and being seen as Americans and equal participants in our civic society as a way to combat hate. So Asian Americans are part of our history. They're a part of our country. Right now, APIs are the fastest growing demographic in this country. At the same time, APIs are underrepresented in positions of power and decision making, and more specifically, Asian Americans have the lowest degree of representation in political office. I hope that some of what I covered is new, and you've learned a little bit more about the Asian American experience. I know I couldn't speak to the whole diversity of the Asian American experience and the issues of facing all of the communities within the scope of what I just said. There are countless powerful stories and events through histories from Indian Americans to Pakistani Americans, Thai, Cambodians, Filipinos, and the list goes on. And I encourage people to take time to dive deeper into the rich histories of those other Asian communities and how they've lived here. And for those who do look deeper, the Asian American experience is anything but simple. So racial frames like this, like the model minority, downplay concerns over rhetoric linking API communities to foreignness and disease that put our communities at risk. They make it easier to dismiss pervasive racism in our country's perspective, and Asian Americans are stuck in between a country that is a binary racial discourse. So I hope as we hear about the issues impacting the API community, we can better recognize the racist frames around us, and we can take steps as a community to stop Asian hate and violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very rich, and I really appreciate you for providing that context and that historical perspective. So hopefully we all, as was mentioned, that we all really take in what information was shared, because this provides a foundational context for us to move forward into some more personal experiences. And just to add, I want to also incorporate a few words to the vocabulary that was mentioned. Racism, it can include discrimination, prejudice, or antagonism directed towards or against someone that is of a different race solely based on the belief that one race is superior over the other. We're going to talk about microaggressions, and those can include statements, actions, incidences. They can include unintentional or intentional, overt or subtle acts against one particular person or a marginalized group based on their racial or ethnic identity. And of course, when we say AAPI, we are meaning Asian American Pacific Islander community. So I want to ensure that in addition to that historical concept that you provide us, that we also are aware of some of those definitions that we're going to be using this evening as we go through our personal experiences. So to really start off on the personal aspect of it, I want to start off with Dorothy, actually, if I may. So I want to start off, if you could share with us, what would you like about or to share with us your cultural experiences based on some of the information that was shared earlier that you would want the audience here to know?
Thank you. So I grew up on Long Island. I'm Taiwanese American, but I was born and raised on Long Island in New York. I feel that I grew up as an Asian American Christian female, and those things kind of really shaped the way I am and I act in certain ways. That confluence of those different factors or attributes. I think I was raised to be somebody who is a little bit more deferential to other people, taught to value being humble, to avoid conflict, to be a certain way, put others first always, and it's a kind of the combination of the different attributes that made me who I am. And then as a grown up, as an adult in the business world, these were things that never served me well in any way. And so I think that those are things that I've thought about a lot as I've kind of grown as a person, to realize that if I want to have some kind of impact in the world, those are things that I need to change about how I am, because I'm living, I grew up maybe with more Eastern values, but I'm living in Western culture. And so those are things that I've had to kind of learn by rote and try to adapt to. So those are kind of some of the things that that I bring to this conversation, things that how I've thought about my upbringing and how that affects who I am today in this world today. One other thing I would note is that although we've heard a lot about the increase in violence over the past year, I personally haven't experienced that, thankfully, and I feel thankful and privileged to be in that situation. But these are things that are happening that are very real in our community, and so there's a lot of issues related. We're going to talk about all of them that I've thought about a lot, though they might not personally affect me that strongly.
Okay, thank you so much. And Weissing, may I have the same question to you? What about your cultural experience would you like to share with the audience today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Malaysian Chinese. My parents grew up in Malaysia. My grandparents are from China. So I'm second generation here. My parents moved here in the mid 70s. And so very much grew up in this kind of with an immigrant mentality, right? I have no extended family here in the US other than my immediate family. And that kind of removes this kind of safety net that I enjoy with my parents. And so you kind of make your own luck, and that was very much ingrained in the way my parents have taught me. You need to work hard, you need to accomplish things and be successful based off your based off of what you know and how you can take advantage of that. I think similar to Dorothy. Grew up with that kind of differential, don't rock the boat too much kind of differential mentality, and that has similarly colored my professional life, right? I've had to learn that there's no one who's going to advocate for me better than myself, and I think having a Caucasian wife, as I've gotten a closer peek at how she was raised and how different that was for in her upbringing. And I think as we're raising our girls, this is the kind of debate that I'm having internally, what's the right way of doing it? Because there if you see my daughters, they look Chinese, right? Like they have very Asian Chinese, okay, a little bit. They have very Asian Chinese features, and so like what's the right way to raise them? Like, and how do I combat like some of that model minority myth and some of that, some of the kind of stereotypes that you have, like, oh, you're Chinese, so you must play the piano, be good at math, and be good at computers. All things that I do, but like, but like that doesn't mean that you have to, right? And so I think that's the kind of perspective that I take to this.
Thank you so much for sharing. And then Eunice, if I may ask the same question to you, what about your cultural experience would you like to share with us today?
So I was born and raised in Seattle, Washington, but I don't have the typical immigrant story because my family moved back and forth between Seoul, South Korea, and Seattle while I was growing up. And I spent like kindergarten all the way up to 6th grade.
Oh, the joys of in person, right? Coming back.
Okay. Oh yeah. So from kindergarten to 6th grade, I was educated I lived in Korea, and there I was a member of a majority in a society. And then I come here, and I'm fully aware of a minority in the society. I think that's the unique aspect that I can bring to this conversation of like experience of having that experience of being a majority and a minority, and how how these are just fabricated ideas, and they are just something that we can challenge and change, and these are not concrete things that we have to live with. We can always change that. So that's, yeah.
Thank you so much. And so the next question will go to Wai Sing. So you mentioned this a little bit in providing us with a piece, of your cultural experience. But from your perspective, how has structural or systemic racism impacted the AAPI community?
Yeah, so, as we were prepping for this, and I was doing the thoughts for this, I was like, oh, it hasn't really affected me that much. Like, I think, and then, as I thought more deeply about it, it's this idea of like model minority, we're the model minority, and thought a little bit more of the implications of what that means. And so, when I'm staying within my lane and I'm a good upstanding citizen, I think all is good, right? Like you're very much seen as an extension of like the white person. But I think as soon as you start straying off of that a little bit, I become more outspoken, or I become, as a male in the at work, sometimes you get more aggressive with showing an opinion or stuff like that. All of a sudden, I'm breaking that mold of being this model person, and then that starts working against you very, very quickly. And as I thought about this even more, I started looking up some stats on this in the marketplace, and there was a 2015 report called "Illusions of Asian Success," where they say 27%. They looked at tech companies in Silicon Valley, and they said that 27% of workers are Asian, but only 19% of them are managers, and only 14% of them are executives. Where for white people, 62% of them were professionals, but 80% of the executives were white. When you start breaking this down even further, you find the disparity is even greater than the glass ceiling that women have versus men, right? Men are 42% more likely to be an executive, but when you select for white men and white women, they account for 154% more executives than Asians holding the role. And so I think ultimately this is that kind of like structural racism that's there. It's just like, even though we are well known as being good at math or stereotypically good at computers or whatever that might be, and we are a decent part of the workforce, we suffer a lot more in being able to hold high positions of power, right? And to what Michael said, it was like this is not only in the workplace, but this is like even more in our government. And so, yeah, I think that's the big thing that I see.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I want to dig a little bit deeper in regards to some of the personal experiences that you've all had faced. And I want to start off with Eunice. You described that, when you were in Korea, you were of the majority. Everyone sort of provided the same responses, and the culture, everything was the same. But coming to Seattle, that might have been a bit different. Can you describe to us just your encounter with that experience, and any sort of prejudice or discrimination that you faced, and how did that make you feel?
So I have a personal experience that captures that. So I came back to Seattle, when I was 11 or 12, and then that time I was at a community pool playing with my sister, and then there's this. Sorry. So I'll just start from. So when I was 11, I just got back from living in Korea for like 7 years, and I was playing with my sister at a community pool, and we're speaking Koreans, and this white couple, maybe in their 40s or 50s, were mocking us, like mocking our language. And as a kid, that was really surprising that, one, adults can be that rude, but two, it was a rude awakening that because I'm an Asian, I'm a minority, and as a minority, as an Asian American minority, that it is okay to be made fun of for being Asian and for speaking different language, because you don't hear people making fun of, like, you really don't hear that much about people mocking other people speaking European languages in that way. So that is, I think, that was a rude awakening for me. And at that point, because I was really young, I felt like I had to hide that difference, that my Asianness, which sets me apart from other people. And I felt very small, and like I had to hide that differences. However, for me, because of my upbringing, where I moved back and forth, like every 2-3 years I go to Korea to visit my family, where there I can see that I'm a majority there again. And that just got me thinking about that couple, that incident where they felt they had this boldness to mock someone for them being Asian, and how that is based on very unfounded racial superiority, basically, and how they have no basis to do that. So I think that's how I kind of made sense of that, and like kind of came out of that experience, basically.
Thank you so much just for your vulnerability and sharing that. I want to pose the same question to Dorothy. What were, or if there were any sort of acts of prejudice or discrimination that you've experienced as well, and how has that shaped sort of your perspective?
So, I mean, first of all, I think I want to kind of name the fact that, like, a lot of these experiences that we've had, like, at times it feels like, well, it's like really not that bad. Like, should we be complaining about it? Especially when you think about, everything that a Black American might experience, and, the potential for police violence and all kinds of other kinds of discriminations. But like, this year has been really interesting because it's the first time that anybody ever reached out to me saying, hey, how are you feeling about all the Asian American violence that's going on right now? How are you feeling in your identity? Like, asking questions about my identity and how I feel about it, like, has never happened really before. And so I really appreciate that that is something that, like, feels like collectively as a society is coming to light more. And like, even the fact that we're having this conversation now, like, thank you all for being here and making space for us. Like, it's really meaningful. And so to have the opportunity to kind of share these experiences and like, even though, we're not trying to make a competition out of who, bears more racism than others. So, we don't have to think about that, but to shine a light on what we do experience is amazing. For me, I think, some of the things that I've experienced are, these are things that, like, I think me and a lot of other Asian American friends of mine have talked about a lot more this year than ever before, and and because of that, I think a lot of people are starting to realize that they've experienced things that like actually might have been racism that they didn't really realize.
Right.
And that's been interesting to see. You know, people who, for example, you know, didn't think it was because that they're Asian that they keep getting passed over for promotion or being treated a certain way. But when they start to think about it, actually, there is a little bit of a pattern there. And you know, the numbers that Wai Sing mentioned, like, speak to that. Yeah, is it just a coincidence, you know, that such a large percentage of a workforce is not getting placed into managerial positions, or is it the culture of corporations and industries that exist in the U.S.? And then the other thing I think is like the idea of those acceptable racisms, like Eunice mentioned. I think we see a lot of that still today. You know, it's like okay, kind of, to make a political cartoon about Andrew Yang, who's running for mayor of New York City,
Wow.
like, which should be, you know, one of the most progressive cities in this country, and to give him kind of like chinky eyes, like, that's not okay. That's not okay today, and for that to be like something that is considered editorially acceptable is crazy. You wouldn't see that kind of caricature happen in you know, in a lot of other spaces. And then, you know, certain things like any catcalling that I've ever gotten is always racial, always. And like, you know, that's unsolicited comments from strangers about how I look. That isn't cool, and that's like kind of okay in society. You know, nobody ever comes to your defense when you hear somebody call me a China doll or something. That's not cool. And so there's things like that that I think we didn't touch upon this quite yet, but there's like another element of that for female Asians, like you know, this other frame of like some kind of weird hypersexualization that like made the shootings in Atlanta kind of be considered like maybe not that bad or not taken as seriously as they should have been. And that's a really unfortunate part of, you know, how Asian American women experience life.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to touch up a little bit more because Wai Sing, you mentioned this in regards to, you know, some of the stereotypes and some of the sort of words and comments that were slurred. If you can share with us, like, what can be done to help reduce or remove some of those negative effects of stereotypes? Because like you mentioned, the model minority, and I know you provided that wonderful context behind it, but what can be done? What are some action steps, you know, that can be done, do you think, to reduce this negative effect?
I think it's a lot of just speaking up, right? You know, one of the things that I've enjoyed doing at work is mentoring other people, and I have seen, you know, even at my work, you know, there are Asian females who have been passed over for promotion 2 times when they have done more than enough to meet the bar, right? And I think all you can do in those things is speak up and be an advocate and do everything you can to right the wrongs. I think, you know, as an Asian male, I definitely have it easier. I mean, if you should Google the kind of paper I was talking about, and one of the things inside there was it shows that of all the races, like, Asian females have it worst across being a manager, being an executive, like, by a long margin, like more than Hispanic females, more than Black females. They have it worse versus parity. I think, and so finding, like, being an ally for those who suffer from this, like, either by making yourself vulnerable in these places, like the way that many corporations work, it's a lot of like social and political capital, and being willing to risk it when you're in a position of power and being able to do this, then like then don't forget that that these things are. That is your opportunity to right the wrong. And so even though that a lot of these things are very subtle, like I work for a very data-driven, very like progressive kind of company, but even we have these problems. And so I think that's the biggest way to break some of it.
Thank you so much. And let's tap into that. Let's tap into some of that intersectionality between, the genders, females and males. And if I may ask, Dorothy, how has that, or if that has affected you within the workplace or within your community, that intersectionality between gender roles and what that means for you and your perspective?
Yeah. In the workplace specifically, like, I remember there was this one time I was at a PR agency, and my boss, who was the president of the agency, it was this very small agency, asked me to go into a pitch meeting with him for a potential new client that was like, I don't remember what it was now, but something science or technology based, and he was like, you have a science degree, and also I think you're great in pitches because you look a little exotic, and that's like interesting. I was like, what? Like, what does that even mean? Like, I didn't work there for very long. And that's, part of the reason it's like, that's not exactly a welcoming environment to be in where, I can feel like I am being judged by the merit of my work. It was a really strange moment. But I think that, like, those things don't happen so overtly most of the time. One of the experiences I saw earlier in my career as well was that of like a white man and an Asian woman who were both senior to me, and I saw their careers progress over the course of about 5 years across 2 different companies. And I could see how much harder this Asian woman worked, like to Weissing's point, the hours that she pulled, the dedication, and the comparison between that and this white man who started at the same level as her, worked far fewer hours, but like was way better at kind of talking himself up and kind of schmoozing and he progressed just so much faster and continues to. So I kind of like studied them and the way they worked and like took notes and was like, oh, okay, like, these extra hours that she's putting in, like, they don't really count for anything, like, what can I do to make sure like that isn't me? But like, not everybody has that opportunity, and like, really unfortunate for me. I mean, she's still a dear friend of mine, yeah, it's a difficult situation to be in when that's not your nature, but that's just like the nature of corporate America.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing. And I want to pose the same question to Eunice. How has that intersectionality affected you, either within the workplace or within your community?
And just so that people have the context of what we're talking about, the intersectionality we're talking about here is the gender and the race, Asian American. So for women, Asian American women are fetish, people have sexual fetish and objectifies women that way. And for Asian American men, they're emasculated. They're not manly enough. So that's the intersectionality that we're discussing here. And for me, the experience I have personally, not at this current place, but a previous workplace, during my first performance review, my supervisor at the time said, as a compliment to me, that, oh, I thought you'd be timid. And that he was surprised that I wasn't. And I think that really reveals the perception that, like, incorrect perception that people have of Asian American women, which is that they will be docile or subservient, and that they would just work hard and put in a work setting and not make any noise, not speak up, not a leadership material. Not take initiatives, but he was surprised I wasn't that. So that was my experience. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing And I want to jump into sort of the community's response. We've all been aware of a lot of the recent violence and hatred that has occurred in our country. But in addition to that, in the past few months, we've also seen our community be more vocal about anti-Asian racism, whether it's through increased attention on the issue, social media coverage, legislation changes. And I want to pose this question first to Wai Sing, and then I'll go to the other panelists. But what does this mean for you, this sort of resurgence of vocal voices speaking out against anti-Asian racism that has been happening within our community?
Yeah, it's something that it's a question that I've definitely been asking myself and talking to friends about over the last couple months. It's like, what does this all mean? In some ways, I'm kind of torn, right? I'm really happy that there's a spotlight on racism of any kind, right? To show that like these things are bad, right? And it brings attention to the cause, right? And those are all valiant things, and we should keep on doing them. There's a part of me that worries about copycat crimes. Like, I don't know how much of the kind of like Asian like hate crimes that there have happened over the last couple months are copycat because like, oh, I saw someone on TV who did this, so like somehow that justifies that I should go do this, right? Or and then it kind of drew me into a very different place, right? Of, on one hand, all these overt kind of racist kind of things, I think if you talk to most sane people, right, who don't have mental illness, they would come to you and you could ask them about like, is pushing a 70-year-old Asian woman down on the New York street, is that okay? Most people say no, that's a terrible thing to do. Like, and this is why it's been derided on the media and brought up so much. And that's right. But I think what that kind of misses is the kind of a personalization of some of the racism. And so it's kind of this difference between overt, which is like, you push a grandma down versus like this kind of covert racism. And I think this covert racism is the thing that really is far more dangerous. And if we don't fix it, like we will never fix the overt. And so an example of covert racism is you imagine two people. It doesn't matter they're white, black, they're just two exact same people. They walk in the door here and they stand in front of you. One of them speaks with a British accent and one of them speaks with a Southern accent. I guarantee you, for many of you, including myself, that when the British person speaks, or the person who speaks with a British accent, you're going to think they're more sophisticated, more intelligent, like all of these things. As soon as the guy with the Southern accent, says a hi y'all, like you're going to think like, oh, you're less educated, and maybe you're a little funny, all these kind of things. You're going to think less of the person. But this is like a covert racism that we all do, right? And like including myself. But like this is the thing that we ultimately need to attack. And if we never fix this, like we can do all the marches, and I'm not saying those things are bad things. We absolutely need to fix the structural racism that's out there, and marches are a great way to do this. But we need to also like look personally, internally it's easy to say, well, I'm not a racist. I'm an ally, and I want to fix the structural racism. But you can also fix it by looking at how you think. That instantaneous thing of when someone speaks, in that 100 milliseconds when you first hear their voice, that judgment that you make on that person is the thing that I think we need to all think about and kind of like attack.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And Dorothy, if I may ask the same question to you, what does this mean for you, this sort of more vocal community response against this issue?
I think a lot of us experienced like learning a new term last year, anti-racism, right? Like through Black Lives Matter and bringing to light what does it mean to be racist? What does it mean to be actively combating racism against Black Americans? And I think that it's an interesting thing that this year the Asian American experience is being talked about a lot more now, and everyone can kind of start to learn how to adapt anti-racism as it relates to Asians as well. And so there's a lot of the same things that apply, you know, those kind of prejudices, like taking those away and actively working against them, learning how to be a good ally, whether that's in the workplace or just like, you know, you see an incident, you overhear something happening on the street, on the subway, actively advocating for the person that's experiencing something unsavory. And just, you know, there's so many more resources that have come to light. Bystander training. You know a lot more about this than I do. I'll let you speak to that more. But that's like another like term that I never heard before last year. But there's all sorts of resources. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
I think for me, these unfortunate events that led to attacks against Asian American elders has finally brought light to Asian American issues like never before. Asian Americans have been invisible in America for a very long time. Even when we have racial discussion about race equality, it always kind of, like Michael
black or
said,
white.
it was a very binary conversation.
Right.
Asian Americans didn't have a seat at that table, but now we are finally, like we are now, like we're talking about the experience we had. And like Dorothy said, it's not about like who's a victim to racism more than the other, but it's just that we also have experiences here as being a perpetual foreigner. I'm sure Spanish flu 1918, I'm pretty sure, I didn't check this, but like Spanish Americans weren't attacked the way Asian Americans were attacked. And the fact that whenever there's a US and Asian country like geopolitical issues happening, Asian Americans are tied to that issues. Whenever there's a US versus European countries having issues, white Americans, nothing to do with it. So there's that distinguishment that's made there, but not here. And Americans have shown they are mature enough to distinguish like blank Americans and where they're from or where their country's from. But for Asian Americans, because of that perpetual foreigner stereotype, every time there's some issues, Asian Americans are the ones being attacked. And I think another reason why that's the case is because, to be honest, like 90% of the things Michael said, I never heard that before today, basically. I'm from Washington State. I didn't know about that Tacoma attack. And that's because I was never taught that in school. Like Asian Americans representation in US history class, basically zero. We may learn a little bit about how Chinese workers came to build railroads in the mid-19th century, or how Japanese Americans, against their will, were in an internment camp during World War II because for some reason the US government thought that they were linked to Japan and imperialist government of Japan. But that's about it. We don't know anything. We rarely cover, we rarely cover anything Asian American, and we make so many contributions to this country for at least 2 centuries. And I think and now there's legislations passing state by state, like Illinois passed it, where Asian American history has to be now taught in public school. New Jersey and New York states are now discussing to do that as well. And I believe federally, US Representative Meng from New York has, or she's working on the legislation to also do, to promote Asian American history teaching at the federal level. So I think because of these events that happened, there is this drive to now to kind of make us visible in this country. Right. Before then, they always ask us oh, I'm so surprised you speak English so well. Really, why would you assume? Why would you think that I would not speak English well? You know, you don't ask that questions to other people. So I think this has been a good change. And So there's a lot of resources, like bystander intervention trainings, those are free. For women, I also enrolled in this class where, like, self-defense class, because Dorothy and I, if we're at the wrong place at the wrong time right now, we could be the next victim, and we have to, and there are resources out there now for that, and I carry, since the attack, I carry a self-defense keychain, because gifted by my friends because they're worried about me. So there are now, unfortunately, because of these events, like, there are resources out there to protect ourselves. Yeah.
Okay, and let's expand on that a little bit, if I may, Eunice. And what are some other additional things that we can do to bring about long-term change in this fight against racism and anti-Asian hate, against these prejudices, stereotypes, this sort of environment in which there's this attack and this hatred and violence, towards this community? What are some things that you feel that we can do to bring about change on that?
I think it is, so I'm a history geek, so I think really learning about Asian Americans' history, I think that would, and everyone having proper education about that, and the nuances of the differences and the diversity of Asian American communities. Like Michael said, there's like 20-some plus countries represented in AAPI, like from Indians to Samoans to Koreans to Thai or Taiwanese. Like, in those countries, they would never see themselves as one, but here we're labeled under this one monolithic group, right? So I think learning the nuances, and I believe in education, so I think by educating people through implementing this curriculums, I think that would make a long-term change in the society.
Okay.
I'm being hopeful.
Thank you. Listen, I'm hopeful with you, okay? And Dorothy, if I may ask you the same question from your perspective, what are some things or one thing that you think we can do to bring about some long-term change against this fight?
Long-term change is really hard, but I think people can make changes in little ways in their lives. And I think that just like any other group that gets discriminated against, like everyone wants to just be treated with respect and to not have assumptions be made about them. And that may be harder if you're trying to relate to somebody who you don't look like. But there's things you can do, for example, learning how to pronounce somebody's name the right way who has a foreign name, and really making the effort to learn, how they prefer to be addressed. It's a little thing that people can do to show a little bit more respect for somebody's being and culture. And then, kind of to touch again on the idea of like being actively anti-racist, calling it out when you see it, not letting it be acceptable. Something that I recently realized is like, the show The Office, like, it's a hilarious show. It's great. They really defy a lot of stereotypes. But one that they really don't is about Asian Americans. Like, there aren't really any, at least East Asian Americans featured on the show. And when they are, like, the waitresses from the hibachi restaurant, there's this theme of like, oh, all Asians look the same. Like, I can't even remember which one is like the girl I'm interested in today. That's not okay, And so kind of calling it out when you see it, not letting those kinds of like acceptable racisms be acceptable anymore.
Thank you so much for sharing. And Wai Sing, I want to ask you the same question as well. I know you touched a little bit on it, but I want to dig deeper today. We're going to get real serious. But I want to hear from you. What are some things you think that can be done to bring about some long-term change?
Yeah, I mean, like Eunice and Dorothy, I think they touched on many of the big points here, right? And we'll echo a lot of that. I think it's being active against it, right? It's voting, right? You can't complain about our government if you don't vote and if you don't be part of it, right? Like there's a primary just last week here in Jersey City. How many of you voted? Just think about that. So, one,
We got
yes.
one person in the audience. For those watching, one person in the audience.
So like it's active participation, not only in our government, but in if you get the opportunity to be in a position of power or privilege, taking advantage of that and remembering those around you that are not as privileged as you are, right? And going after that, and really remembering those, when you look at the stats, like how can you equalize them? How can you do your part in those things? How do you, if you're a manager and you have, an Asian people and Asian men or women under there, like just remember that the table's tilted against them, and like how can you just lift it up just a little bit to equalize it again? I think those are the big things. And then finally, to personalize this, right? Remember that racism isn't a new thing. It's been around for thousands of years, right? Since the dawn of man. As soon as we started being different, like there's been people who have been better than others, right? And or perceived as better than others. And so just don't shy away from that and realize and just be self-aware enough to kind of examine your actions and your thoughts around, well, maybe I shouldn't make that joke, right? Or what am I thinking in that 100 milliseconds when I first meet someone and they open their mouth and say something, right? And sometimes it's deserved, but it's like I say stupid things all the time, but in general, you want to try to give people the benefit of the doubt and look at them in the best light.
Thank you so much. And before we turn into audience questions, I just want to take the moment to thank all of you for sharing your experiences. Thank you, Michael, for providing that historical context and those data and stats. And if everyone here and online, please join me in just giving them a round of applause, because they've been really great, and their vulnerability. So before I turn to the live audience questions, we do have one question that was posed online that I want to share with you guys, and then we'll open it up to those here. So the question is, what advice would you give younger Asian Americans trying to work their way up in their workplace and sensing racism in the workplace?
I'd say find mentors, right? I think the strongest thing, the thing that's helped me most at my work is finding a strong mentor, someone who's, it doesn't always have to be someone who's senior. If there's a mentorship program in your workplace, take advantage of it, right? Meet people, establish your network, have people truly see you for your worth, right? And I think that is one of the biggest ways to do it. And I've talked to my mentor about every single career change that I've had within my company over the last 10 years. And he's been there to both support them as manager sometimes and sometimes as just someone to talk me through it and talk through the political implications of what other people are thinking about. And I think as someone who's less experienced, getting that experience of how to navigate an organization is really critical to your long-term success.
Okay, thank you so much. Would anyone else want to weigh in on that as well?
One other thing, a term that I've learned more recently as well is the value of having a sponsor within your workplace, which is different from a mentor. Right? A mentor, I'm asking Wysing for advice on how to deal with my boss, Eunice, but but the mentor and my boss don't speak to each other. Whereas a sponsor is somebody who is more senior to you, where Eunice is actually advocating for me in a way that is helping me in my workplace. And thank you, Eunice, for that. Your direct boss might not be that person, but there may be somebody else who's senior who understands your value in a different way and can advocate for what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
I think preemptively, this was actually an advice that was given to me. As an Asian American, again, we are not expected to speak up or take initiatives. So break that stereotype, take initiatives, speak up first. Don't wait for the room to quiet down and then speak your mind. Half the people there are also, they don't know what they're talking about, right? So have confidence You don't need to know everything.
Yeah.
Just have confidence and speak up, be heard. You know, that would be more like a preemptive advice.
Yeah.
But if they are actually facing racist, like discrimination at work, I mean, they should report that.
Yeah.
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 And if it's more of a covert nature versus overt, then I think this is true for most people, whoever you are. If you're a junior in your career, like figure out what the game actually is, and learn how to play it. And then when you're in a position of authority, you can change that game. But like figure out what the game actually is, because it's usually not what you think it is.
Yeah, nice. Thank you so much. So I want to open it up to any questions that the audience might have. And once you ask those questions, I will repeat it for those watching online in case they can't hear you because you don't have the mic on you. Yes.
Thank you to all the panelists. I had a question about generational mindset of racism, especially like our parents. My parents immigrated to the U.S. They are U.S. citizens, but they still, I think they still identify as foreigners. What are some helpful ways you think as children of immigrant parents who are a bit more aware of, these topics, what's a good way to engage and have these types of conversations with parents?
Thank you. And I'm going to sort of repeat that question, especially for those watching online who didn't hear that. And please correct me if I interpret it incorrectly. But sort of how to address or engage in those conversations with parents that may have immigrated here who are unaware of really the historical context in regards to the racism and those particular violence and hatred that has been occurring within our country. All right.
I'll be honest, my parents are like late 70s, 80s, like I don't. Like they're not changing the way they think about anything or do anything. I don't really have those kinds of tough conversations with them.
I have the opposite. Like I think my parents, having immigrated in the 70s, my dad was in New York City when it was not such a nice city to be in. I think he, on the other hand, sees those things, right? And so it's more of a, I think it's a different kind of conversation to have. It's less about, I think he, like both my parents kind of understand the kind of Asian stereotypes that are here in the U.S., but I think may not fully appreciate the other types of racisms that are there for other races, right? And so they may not see that, well, that same thing that they feel like, I was like, oh, you pulled me over because I'm a, small Chinese lady driving a car, like I didn't run a stop sign, but you pulled me over anyways. Like, well, like our black friends have that all the time, and it's far more crazy, like, and far more dangerous. And so I think for me, it's a different kind of like discussion to be having with them.
Thank you.
Can't relate because my parents are in Korea.
I mean, I think it's a funny thing because my parents, like my mom, for example, like if somebody, like a stranger speaks to her and is like, ni hao, she is delighted by that, She's like, oh, they're trying to connect with me and they've learned a little bit of Chinese. That's so cool. Where I'm like deeply offended, So we experience life in very different ways.
Thank you for your question. Anyone else have a question from the audience? Yes. Oh. Okay.
Afraid of the mics now. Is this making a difference? Okay. I was wondering, so if you are a boss who would rather not have, like, it feels like the rules we're talking about are very American rules, right? You have to speak up and stand out. How can a leader make space to recognize the worth of people who might not be like the brazen, loud person? Like, what would you do to kind of make other opportunities to stand out?
I think it's a really good question. I've thought about this a lot more from the a perspective of just being a woman and mentoring other women in the workplace, I think I haven't mentored as many Asian Americans, but I think there's some similarities there, at least from my perspective and how I've shaped who I am. But for example, women don't necessarily advocate as much for themselves for a raise or a promotion, and so I give them when they're not asked for at times, which is like not protocol necessarily. But it's like, well, they deserve to be recognized. It shouldn't have anything to do with when you ask and when you advocate for yourself. So it's like making sure you're taking the time to understand the value of each of your people and what they contribute, and not making it contingent upon whether they're advocating for themselves or not. Like that's one way to kind of equalize advancement opportunities for all kinds of people who are not advocating for themselves, whether they are just a little bit more introverted or timid or whoever they are.
Yeah, I think I run a lot, like, so I manage a fairly large team, and a lot of the stats that I'm doing on the back end is figuring out tiers of seniority and trying to make sure that people who are of similar years of experience and are performing in similar ways advance similarly in pay and in both in compensation and in title, right? And so, there's people in my group that I've essentially banded them all together, and so long as they're continually to perform at the high levels that they're currently performing, I basically advance them all at the same time as much as I can. I think that runs into a lot of other like company issues, it's like, well, I only have so many advancement slots, and so like you have to sometimes trade different things off, or like, oh, maybe I'll give you a little bit more pay, but like not give you the title, but you try to work with them and try to be as transparent as possible about the constraints that I have, right? It's like, it's not that I'm trying to hold you back or any sort of way, but like ultimately I'm looking at your compensation and your title as an entire package, and work with me to understand of like here's where I can push and here's where I can't. And so I think that's a good way to do it as well.
That's really important work, like not perpetuating the wage gaps that exist
Yeah.
and promotion gaps. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you for this panel. I've learned a great deal from Michael. My question kind of deals with what he kind of brought up in terms of history. And this is I'm not trying to put a monolith on it, but I'm trying to kind of make a point. So my question is in the past, where did you guys see as a problem where like the Asian community has not kind of stuck up for other races, or vice versa? Where do you think the problem was in your opinion? Do you think it was more internalized in terms of how kind of the Asian community views itself in terms of to the outside, or vice versa in terms of how the outside views in? And I'd love to get your thoughts in terms of course, as you know, there was a major movement because of George Floyd, and there was kind of a question that happened that kind of separated when the Asian hate started to happen. That was so prevalent. And I guess the prevailing question is how come both groups didn't kind of band together? And I guess my question to you is that, do you feel that it was more internalized in terms of how a community feels, or was it more of like, well, that's their problem, they deal with it, and we'll deal with our problem in our own way?
Eunice, I'm curious of what your thoughts are on this.
Trying to be careful not to sound too controversial.
Don't be timid, Eunice.
Yeah,
It's
safe
only
space.
broadcast to the entire.
Yeah.
Not about being timid.
Safe
It's about
space.
life. I know everyone here, but I don't know who's watching. I think hard question. Good question. Hard question. I think like that model minority myth, I think the US society, I think, or the people in power who historically have been white people, I think created like examples like model minority myth to pit like one racial group against another. And I think that division has kind of like, you can see that culminate, the fruit of it basically in Rodney King and the LA riot. I think that really shows, and to this day I think there are a lot of Korean Americans who are very, I mean, because they went through it, they're very biased in what happened in, I think it's 1992 or 1994, the LA riot. And I think to combat that, I think we need to understand like what type of system we're placed in. That the minorities, the racial groups, we're fighting for the little resources that we have gotten, like whether that be financial assistance from government, like budget or interest, the time and resources from government. I think we had to fight against each other. And I think that's where the distrust had been historically. But I think with the Black Lives Matter in 2020 and the Asian, the hate crime against Asian American, I think that has demonstrated that there are people, like the members from different racial communities are now advocating and supporting each other. Yes, there are still like, of course, attacks. This historical context is not going to go away overnight, but I think we're having conversations, you know, the communities are having conversations, and I think we're being more aware of like the type of system we are placed under, where we always thought of each other as with distrust, and I think it's just getting better, hopefully.
Hopefully, Kamala will bring us all together.
Yes.
No, but one of the ongoing issues that really does kind of pit us against each other is something like affirmative action, for example, where it's like there's certain quotas set for different racial groups, literally pitting racial groups against each other in a way that is not necessarily the healthiest. Now, I'm not against affirmative action. I think there's so much nuance there. It's such a tricky, complex issue, and I don't know what the right solution is. But I think that is one of those things that like continues to create a divide, unfortunately, that feels very real. And you know, the model minority myth kind of plays into that. It affects it a lot because, you know, you maybe limit the number of Asian Americans that get into a certain kind of college because there's a percentage of them that are excelling where they are. But there's a huge percentage that are extremely disadvantaged and they don't have opportunities just because they're Asian American. And that feels wrong. I don't know what the answer is. But there's got to be some way that we can all work together on finding the right solutions that, you know, don't continue to perpetuate these kind of false divides that we've created.
I think the only thing I'd add is that, like, I think the view that the different races are against each other is very much perpetuated by the media, right? And so, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Like everyone from Martin Luther King to everyone who's blazed a pathway for Black Americans have basically blazed a pathway for all white races, right? And against racism. And so you know, we celebrate, you know, Martin Luther King just as much as, you know, the Black Americans do as well. And I think some of that just isn't reported, right? I think the idea that you know, we can come to a place and see it as a, you know, come to America and see this as a place of opportunity is really, you know, you can only do that because someone before you has made some kind of sacrifice to make that happen. And so I think I only wish that we would report it more and we would do it more, right? Like I think to see more Asians standing lockstep with Hispanics, Latinos, like blacks, of all races, to stand against this stuff, I think is the dream, right?
Thank you.
Can I actually touch on that just because from a political perspective, over the last couple of years, when you look at movement building organization, advocacy organizations, and progressive social justice organizations behind the scenes, we have actually been seeing that a lot more. So I know a lot of API organizations that work with Black civil rights organizations, Black immigrant rights organizations. So we are seeing more of that intersectionality. And I would say that, I don't want to get too political, but we've seen a lot of that post-Trump. So after 2016, there was a lot of issues that were converging where a lot of identity groups and marginalized populations felt that they were being attacked, and then they recognized that there's some overlap with, maybe like border wall stuff and climate justice along the border or something. And then, so Hispanic organizations and environmental organizations starting to get together, or, as of now, over the last couple of years, I have seen a lot more, API organizations work with Hispanic and Black organizations. So it's cool to see.
Okay, thank you. So we have room for one more question, and then we'll, thank you, wrap it up.
First of all, thank you guys. It's not easy to, I think, experience a lot of the things that you guys have experienced, let alone rehash it, prepare, and then share. And I think it takes particular courage to do what you guys are doing tonight, so thank you. That being said, I think there's so much power in hearing about experiences and hearing different perspectives. So I'd love to ask the question so that we can kind of get an awareness of where we are, especially as like a church and a body of believers. And so I'd love to hear what you guys think are the particular maybe areas of brokenness where you've experienced API hate, or areas of brokenness just within the church, and also what you think maybe are some opportunities for us to partner with God in his redemption of it all, and his pursuit of justice and mercy in it all, and what we might be able to do. I know it's hard because I think a lot of the things that you said are what Christians need to be doing. But if there's like maybe something a little bit more specific to the church, I think that'd be helpful to hear.
I think in terms of redemption, I'll plug, my wife is Hope's prayer director, and so she's like, she does prayer, we do First Seek this morning, like at 8 a.m. Rachel was presenting, and we're praying about redemption for racism here in the church, and so like if you're going to talk about like trying to redeem something, like you got to ask, right? And so like prayer is the fundamental way of doing that, and I think that's where we should turn first, right? And like ask an all-powerful, all-knowing God to fix the thing that's broken. I mean, that seems like, for me at least, the kind of first thing to turn to. In terms of actual pains that I've experienced like at church, I haven't necessarily like experienced that. I mean, I've been lucky there. Hope is a very one of the things that kind of drew me to this church and to Craig is that we were a racially diverse church. Like, I've told Craig this many times, like just standing in the back of, when we all met in person, I was just like, look at this. It's like, I think we had something like 20 some countries represented, like and it's really, really beautiful of being able to go someplace that's so racially diverse and kind of experience what the kingdom of God actually is, right? Which is a racially diverse kind of like experience.
Yeah, I mean, as a church, we also over-index on Asians, I think, by a lot. So, so it's a very comfortable place. I haven't experienced anything wrong. I think Hope and Jersey City are like perfect.
I echo that for Hope Jersey City. I love the diversity here. But and I'm not talking about Hope Jersey City. This is more just like an American church. And
That's a different story.
That's a very different.
Yeah.
yeah, and I don't remember.
I really thought you meant literally.
Hope Jersey City is great. But I think American church, I think it's inevitable. Like the American like society, social problems will bleed into the church as well. And I remember, I don't remember what the data was about, but I think you were telling just like people, and I was there too, hearing about it, like this data about just church congregants, and not Hope Jersey City, but just like American church. And I asked, oh, so where's Asian Americans in this data? And I think it was like basically like white, black, and others.
Yeah, I think we're in others.
Yeah, and I'm like, why are we other? Like
Oh my
we
gosh.
are such active members in just Christian faith, especially in American church, and to be we don't even have a label. We're other. I think they should recognize. I think again, just like other things we've said today, like the contribution and like the Asian American Christians are making, and also the roles they play, active roles they play, and give them credit for it, and not just put them as the other. I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think with the Southern Baptist Convention just happened, and like they're voting for their new president, and I think it's a very both racially charged and politically charged kind of like discussion, and I think don't have enough time to really dig deeply into that, but I think to my earlier point, prayer for these kind of things, because these organizations do affect large portions of the American church and the Western church as a whole. Like I think redemption needs to start there, and it starts with prayer for wisdom, and that God calls the right leaders to kind of change that from within.
Because they also influence votes too.
They influence votes. I mean, they influence votes. They influence laws, right? So we go into critical race theory. We can go through all this kind of stuff. Like, they're a very powerful organization, both politically and within like the broader like evangelical church here in the U.S.
I would say, like, I think it's really hard to disentangle politics and church in America. But I think, like, the more we can be vocal about, like, the fact that we care about these issues and inclusivity and equity, and by the way, I'm also Christian, like, is important to kind of demonstrate to people who think that those are separate things. Like, if you're liberal, then you're godless, and if you're conservative, you must be Christian, like, and defying those stereotypes, which I think a lot of us do, but being more vocal about it and showing people an example of how you can show your Christian love in a different way than is expected in the greater kind of American church.
And I think there's one more point on that. Like, I think, we talked about structural racism. We talked about like more personal, like covert things. I think one thing that we didn't touch upon that kind of, Hillary, you're maybe implying is that I think we need to think about is that we are also in contested space, right? Like, I think, depending on your background, whether you're more charismatic or not, like there are other forces there are other spiritual forces at work that are also working against that we cannot see, that you really need to be praying against, and not only the structural things that we talked about and inside within our hearts, but that there's this active fight that's happening behind the scenes as well.
Thank you, and that's actually a really great segue. As we close, I do want to pray us out and just sort of seek God and His guidance, on these topics, as well as our actions in this community to ensure that love permeates, not just within our own spaces, but within our communities and within the world at large. So if everyone can close your eyes and bow with me, and I'll pray us out. Dear God, I thank you for this space. I thank you for this moment in time. I thank you for all of our panelists, Lord, for Wai Sing and Dorothy and Eunice and Michael to share just this informative piece of culture, dear God. I thank you, Lord, for their vulnerability to just be open and to answer questions and to provide us with more awareness and more education on this topic, Lord. I pray that it doesn't stop here, that the learning continues, God, that your word in Luke 10, when it says, dear God, to love your neighbor as yourself, that love just doesn't stop as I love you, that it continues and it shows in action, and it continues and it shows in allyship, dear God. I pray for more individuals, Lord, to stand up. No more bystanders, God. No more people just on the sideline and watching this violence and hatred ensue within our country, dear God. I pray, Lord, that all of us just comes together in unity, that we bring justice and we bring peace upon this situation, Lord. And I pray for everyone here and those watching online that they're able to receive this information and continue working towards a particular presence and space, dear God, where you permeate your grace, your mercy, and your forgiveness in ways that we lack or where we fall short, God, that you are there to pick us up and to remind us of your love and remind us, dear God, that we are human, but in you, God, that we find strength and we find hope and we find courage, Lord, in these spaces. So I thank you so much, dear God, for everyone here. I thank you for hope to provide this space to talk about these conversations. And I pray, dear Lord, that as we continue moving forward in the days out, that we continue to look to you for that guidance, Lord, for that courage, God. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. For those of you here and watching online, we will be providing you with more resources so you can continue that learning on your own. And if you have any other additional questions that maybe we didn't have time to answer, you can email info@Hope Jersey City. Hello at Hope Jersey City for any of those questions that you'd like to pose and ask them. But for everyone here, please give us a round of applause for our finalists, for here this evening. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for joining.